Lieutenant Joseph Smith flew his dauntless dive bomber out of a cloud bank and caught his breath at the sudden sight of a dozen ships far below. Quickly he radioed the carrier Lexington.
Contact. 2 enemy carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, many destroyers.
He had found the Japanese carrier strike force. Exactly 2 minutes later, and roughly 200 miles to the south, Imperial Japanese Navy officer Kenzo Keno banked his Kate torpedo plane and was exalted to discover a similar scene on the ocean surface.
Have sighted the enemy carriers.
He reported to base. The climax to the Battle of the Coral Sea had begun. The battle was historically significant as the first action in which the opposing fleets neither sighted nor fired upon one another. Having broken the Japanese naval code, Nimitz knew that the Japanese would soon launch Operation MO in the South Pacific, to seize the Solomons and Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea. If successful, these conquests would gravely threaten Australia. Based on this intelligence, he sent the Lexington Task Force, then in Hawaiian waters, to reinforce Fletcher's Yorktown Task Force in the Coral Sea. The Navy's most experienced task force commander, Bull Halsey, was now approaching Japan with Enterprise and Hornet, as part of the Doolittle raid, nearly 10,000 miles from the Coral Sea. Nimitz would have to rely on Fletcher, who was less knowledgeable in carrier operations, to lead the battle. The Port Moresby invasion convoy would be escorted by the light carrier Shoho and protected by Rear Admiral Chuchi Hara's carrier strike force, consisting of Japan's newest fleet carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku. On May 3 the Japanese swept into the Solomons and seized Tulagi. On the morning of May 6 Zuikaku and Shokaku sailed into the Coral Sea to cover the flank of the MO invasion force, which was escorted by Shoho. On May 7 a Japanese search plane reported sighting an Allied carrier and cruiser. A massive airstrike from the 2 fleet carriers was quickly launched, but Hara's reconnaissance had critically misinformed him. His strike leader found no carriers, only the tanker Neosho escorted by a destroyer. The frustrated attackers struck the unprotected targets with a vengeance, sinking both ships. At this point a Yorktown scout plane radioed a contact report of 2 Japanese fleet carriers. Fletcher acted decisively, launching 93 aircraft from both carriers, but his luck proved to be as bad as his opponents'. Shortly after the huge formations had flown off in the direction of the sighting report, it emerged that the reconnaissance plane had faulty equipment. Fletcher, greatly irritated, then received a contact report from the Neosho. Uncertain whether the ship's attackers were land or carrier-based aircraft. Soon, however, he received a sighting report of a Japanese light carrier with escorts within 40 miles of his airstrike destination. Fletcher vectored his formation toward the new target of opportunity. The target was the light carrier Shoho, a converted submarine tender. Shoho's 6 combat air patrol Zeros tried to disrupt the attackers but were overwhelmed. Staggered by 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes, the carrier sank in less than an hour, taking with her more than 3/4 of the 834-man crew. The following day, May 8, Fletcher dispatched 18 scouts in a 360-degree dawn search. Rear Admiral Hara sent out 7 search aircraft. Almost simultaneously the opposing carrier strike force spotted each other. The 2 forces were about 240 miles apart. Both task forces steamed toward each other at high speed, the range closing rapidly. Fletcher launched 75 aircraft from the 2 carriers beginning at 9 a.m. 10 minutes later Hara launched 69 aircraft from Zuikaku and Shokaku. Aided by tailwinds, the Yorktown Air Group reached their target first. As they formed their attack, the Zuikaku disappeared into a fog bank. So they concentrated their efforts on the Shokaku. The dive bombers began their assault on Shokaku at 10:57. The 2 carriers were protected by 16 Zero fighters led by Petty Officer Tetsuzo Iwamoto, the Japanese Imperial Navy's leading ace with 14 kills from the China campaign, who would survive the war with 80 kills. Right away it became evident that this was going to be a much tougher mission than sinking the hapless Shoho the day before. The TBD Devastators achieved no torpedo hits on Shokaku, but the dauntless dive bombers did register two 1,000-pound bomb hits that set the flight deck ablaze. Half an hour later, Lexington's strike force arrived and scored another 1,000-pound bomb hit on the already ablaze Shokaku, although she managed to avoid the 11 torpedoes launched against her. The crippled Shokaku had suffered more than 200 casualties and with her flight deck heavily damaged could no longer launch aircraft. She withdrew north, leaving the unscathed Zuikaku to continue the battle. Payback time was already underway for the Japanese. Lexington's radar detected the inbound Japanese aircraft at a range of 78 miles. Due to having only 9 fighters available, Fletcher took the desperate measure of employing his remaining Dauntless dive bombers as interceptors. 23 Dauntless dive bombers were thrown into the fray. The Lexington maneuvered violently through a series of twists and turns to dodge the initial torpedoes, but more were on the way. Task Force 17's anti-aircraft gunners blazed away desperately. The Japanese strike leader would later admit, "Never in all my years have I imagined a battle like that." The dauntless pilots downed several Kates but fared poorly against the escorting Zeros, for were shot down. Zeros and Wildcats spun, dove, and climbed in the midst of the bomber formation. Burning and shattered planes of both sides plunged from the skies. The air-to-air action was sustained and violent. When Duran Matson landed his Wildcat after this action, his crew found the Grumman fighter riddled with 21 shell holes from 20mm cannon fire and countless machine gun bullet holes. Despite these heroics, Lexington was hammered by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The giant carrier shuddered and slowed, engulfed in smoke from the fires below decks. Meanwhile, the Yorktown was fighting her own life or death battle. 14 dive bombers targeted Yorktown. As they made their approach, 2 Wildcats circling above Yorktown were able to penetrate the escorting Zero's defensive screen. They shot down in flames 2 of the Aichi D-3A dive bombers, disrupting the formation's attack run. The anti-aircraft guns of both carriers have been upgraded since the start of war with new Oerlikon 20mm cannon. Yorktown's anti-aircraft gunners blazed away desperately, her fire augmented by nearby escort ships. Not only did the attackers come under fire from the 2 carriers, but they had to run the gauntlet of heavy anti-aircraft fire from 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers. The sea around Yorktown was littered with the burning wrecks of downed Japanese planes. Yorktown was fighting for her very existence and everyone on board knew it. She made violent twists and turns at flank speed to avoid the cascade of torpedoes and bombs thrown at her. Despite 4 aircraft being shot down and many more damaged by anti-aircraft fire that day, the experienced and highly motivated attackers would not be deterred. At 11:26, a bomb exploded a few feet off the ship's port side. The shock wave from the blast was so severe that it violently rocked the carrier from side to side. Aircraft on the deck and hangar were thrown about like toys. The explosion caused significant internal damage. Rivets along joints in the area were sheared or blown completely out, splitting open the hull's armor plating along a large seam. Determined to avenge the loss of the Shoho the previous day, the dive bombers pressed their assault with fanatical resolve. At 11:27, Yorktown's luck ran out. She was hit in the center of her flight deck by a 250-kilogram delayed fuse armor-piercing bomb which penetrated 4 decks before exploding in a storage compartment, killing or seriously wounding 66 men. The blast shattered Yorktown's radar and wrecked 3 of her 10 superheater boilers, which reduced her top speed by 6 knots. Prompt action by repair parties in quickly using fire hoses down through the bomb hole quickly brought the fire below deck under control. A repair party, with rescue breathers, entered the smoke-filled compartment to clear wreckage, recover casualties, and extinguish the smoldering stores. A further 8 near misses were close enough to cause varying degrees of damage. Yorktown's hull above and below the waterline had been pierced by shrapnel which caused leaks and ruptured fuel lines. As the Japanese aircraft headed back to their carriers, they were harassed by Wildcats and Dauntless interceptors. In the ensuing aerial duels, 3 Dauntless and 3 Wildcats were downed while the Japanese lost 1-0 and 4 bombers in response. In spite of damage, the patched-up Yorktown and Lexington were both able to recover aircraft from their returning air groups. Many of the aircraft had been badly shot up, some of the exhausted crew were injured. This all contributed to the loss of 8 aircraft during the recovery operation. Aboard Lexington, despite the devastation below decks, the damage control parties had managed to extinguish all the fires and restored air operations. It was hoped that she could limp to a port for repairs. But one of the torpedoes had ruptured the ship's aviation gasoline storage. This generated gas vapors which permeated through many of the ship's compartments. An hour and 20 minutes had passed since the end of the attack, when sparks from an electric motor ignited gasoline fumes. The resulting fireball ripped through the ship, setting off secondary explosions. Throughout the afternoon, a chain reaction of additional blasts slowly consumed the ship. By 4 o'clock the ship was ablaze from stem to stern. With the fires raging uncontrollably, at 7 minutes past 5 Captain Ted Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. More than 92% of the ship's crew survived the day. At 7:52 the destroyer Phelps finished her with 5 torpedoes. With her crew looking on, Lady Luck sank beneath the waves. The loss of Lexington left Fletcher's task force with 39 operational planes. When Fletcher reported the Lexington's loss to Nimitz, he was visibly shocked. Not willing to risk the damaged Yorktown in another battle against the undamaged Zuikaku, Nimitz ordered Fletcher to withdraw to Pearl Harbor for repairs. This left the Japanese in control of the field of battle, which would enable them to complete their seaborne invasion of Port Moresby. Critically low on fuel, Zuikaku and her escorts sailed north to refuel from the fleet oiler Toho Maru. Late the following day the Zuikaku resumed her hunt for the Yorktown, but by then, she was well on her way out of the Coral Sea. Back at base in Rabaul, Vice Admiral Inoue, in overall command of Operation MO, had lost his nerve. Instead of capitalizing on the Japanese victory in completing the seaborne invasion of Port Moresby, he felt that with only 24 serviceable Zeros now available on the Zuikaku, it would not be enough to protect his troop convoy from Allied ground aircraft. So he recalled the invasion convoy back to Rabaul. Commander-in-Chief Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was furious with his subordinates' timidity. The U.S. denied the battle was a defeat by stating that both sides had lost a carrier and had a carrier damaged, but the sinking of a converted submarine tender with 18 aircraft on board could not offset the loss of one of only 4 fleet carriers then available to the U.S. in the Pacific. Hitler sent his congratulations and hailed the Japanese victors of the Coral Sea. Yet the objective of the American task force was to stop the seaborne invasion of Port Moresby, so even though they lost the battle they still achieved their objective. Not only did they save Port Moresby, but the Coral Sea campaign was the high water mark for the Japanese in the South Pacific. Never again would they threaten the vital sea lines of communications to Australia, and so ultimately the Coral Sea campaign would rightly go down in history as a great American victory. Don't forget to subscribe and press that bell icon so you don't miss the next video.